You probably don't want to start the recording until we broadcast.
I'm wondering where the banner is. I just started broadcasting. Should I stop?
Yeah, the banner goes on the
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the first ASAP webinar. We hope that this is going to be a monthly series, and so we look forward to hearing from you on topics that you may be interested in the future. ASAP, for those of you who can't remember what it stands for Accelerating Support to Advanced Local Partners. And we're a global mechanism under USAID, and we're supporting new local partners for PEPFAR. And part of our mandate is to provide this training for new partners and USAID staff implementing local partner transition. This webinar is going to be about an hour and a half. We've allotted time at the end for questions and answers, and we'll take them until we're finished. For those of you who don't want to stay till the end, you're welcome to leave, but we do want to make time available for all participants to ask all their questions. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting it on our website. For those of you that are new to Zoom, if you see the bottom of your screen, there's an orange icon or an icon that says chat. So if you want to communicate with me or IT or our panelists, please write your chat. We'll be monitoring them the whole time. And as courtesy and good etiquette on these webinars, please put your microphone on mute while people are speaking. So again, welcome to this first webinar. Thank you for your patience in getting on. This is our first run with Zoom. We're testing out this platform, and we look forward to your feedback. If you see also on the bottom of your panel, there's something called poll, and there's a place there for you to respond to some evaluation questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand this over to Jason Porter. And Jason, you're on mute.
Yep. Hello, thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Porter. I'm from USAID in the Office of HIV/AIDS with our local partner team. And we just wanted to thank ASAP for hosting this webinar. Thank you all for attending. As part of PEPFAR's local partner transition, which we're working hard on, we wanted to make sure that USAID staff, along with local partners, so having everybody on this webinar, are understanding the USG cost principles. You know, they're very important. And this way, we as an agency can effectively manage our awards and support you are implementing partners so that we're all, you know, understanding of the rules and the regulations that are dictating the management of awards. Our presenter today, Doug Franke from Sustainability Solutions, delivered a longer version of this training during our recent meeting with local partners in Johannesburg, and it was extremely successful and generated a lot of questions. So in light of that, we decided to kind of open up this topic again to a wider audience through a webinar, and working with ASAP to kind of do a webinar series on a number of, you know, very important topics that are related to successful management of PEPFAR awards. Cost principles aren't easy, and we'd like to encourage everybody, the local partners and USAID staff to listen. Please, please, please ask questions on this topic. We'll have about 30 minutes at the end for questions, in which we're sure there'll be a lot of. Now, I just wanted to talk very briefly. If you're implementing PEPFAR programs, you're probably familiar with or heard of expenditure reporting, and it is related to finances, but this is very different than expenditure reporting. Basically, what we're going to be talking about today is the way that the rules and regulations that guide how you can spend your money and manage your money, whereas expenditure reporting is a database that PEPFAR uses for you to actually tell us how you're spending your money and attributing that money that is spent to specific interventions. We'll probably have a training or a webinar and releasing some resources on that at a later date, but just we wanted to kind of clear that up so there's no confusion about the two kind of financial management systems that we deal with in PEPFAR. But with that, we're looking forward to this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to Walt Hammond from our CFO to say a few words before we get started.
Thank you, Doug, Jason. So real quickly, from the CFO or controller standpoint, there are basically about 3 intersections that we come across with the cost principles. One I would call a proactive area, and 2 are more, once you are actually in process or after the fact. So the first one is kind of an opportunity. With controllers' offices, one of the areas that, or one of the pieces that most partners have in their contracts is an advance. And so during that advance process, oftentimes you are in contact with your voucher examiner and the controller's office. It's an opportunity to ask questions as to what you would actually expense later on. And so I would definitely recommend that you have a close relationship with your voucher examiner as you go through the advance process, both, obviously both in the planning your advance and clearing it later on. You can find information on that if you are a NGO through ADS 636. Speaks to program advances. If you are a G2G partner, advances are spoken to in MAG ADS 220, so it's a mandatory reference there. The other 2 are actually when you actually turn your voucher in itself, your voucher examiner is going to look at the expenses that are claimed in that voucher and ask whether they're reasonable, allocable, allowable, or I like to say just ordinary and necessary. And then so that's more of an after the fact. If there is a problem within 7 days, they need to let the partner know that they're kind of freezing a part of that voucher. And then the rest gets paid, and then once this is settled, then that gets paid. The final way, and the one that you absolutely don't want to deal with cost principles, is audits. And so if your grant or your agreement is over $750,000, there is a required audit that goes over your expenses. Same happens at the end when you close your audit. And so, or close your agreement. So that definitely is the route you don't want to go. The first 2 are the advance process is proactive. The second is definitely less proactive, and this is pay us back. So finally, what I would also want to emphasize is please do also use your AOR, your COR, and your contract officers as resources. They know your agreements and what's allowable and what's not allowable, and can also talk to cost principles, fairly eloquently. So that's all I have from the CFO perspective.
Great. Well, thanks, Walter and Catherine and Jason. It's Doug Frankie here. I think Callie may say something while I'm working with Jeff on the technology. Carry on.
Callie or Debbie, do you want to say something?
Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we just want to thank ASAP for hosting this call. As Jason said, it's really important for us to do strong award management, that we all understand the cost principles. That's why this webinar was set up both for local partners and USAID staff. And as Walt mentioned, we strongly encourage our local partners to be in close communication with their AOs and COs and OFM staff at the missions if they have any questions about the content that Doug's going to cover. And we did want to emphasize that this webinar is distinct from expenditure reporting, which is a PEPFAR requirement, but it is not covered under the 2 CFR 200. We'll send out some references to expenditure reporting later. We are working with our ER team here in OHA, Office of HIV/AIDS, to set up some webinars and trainings and resources on the required expenditure reporting for PEPFAR. Maybe I'll pass it back to you, Catherine. I don't know if Doug has been able to.
Well, we're not seeing his screen, so I'm thinking he hasn't.
No. I am sorry. I am in and trying to share here where we were before. It did drop off, but I seem to be. We'll see if that is. If Jeff, are you online still?
You're getting there.
Yes, we
Okay.
can see your screen again. You can just switch to the presentation.
Very good. I will get there.
Always so stressful to get this part done. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. You know, I know you can feel our angst here. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Off we go.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for participating here. I'm going to close that. My name's Doug Franke. I'm the Managing Director of Sustainability Solutions. What we do is work with missions, recipients, and audit firms to help everyone get it right. We're strong believers in and passionate about being compliant with your award and the rules and regulations. And I want to thank ASAP and the missions in Washington for giving us the chance to share what we understand. So as Catherine said, it'll be about an hour presentation, and make notes if you have questions for later on. Certainly, there's a lot to cover here, and we are only going to be able to cover this at a high level because obviously, as everyone has said, Jason, that there's a lot to learn here in WALT, and I'm only going to be able to cover the things that are possibly would put you most at risk. One thing is we are auditors, and we are always wearing our audit hat when working with recipients to try to make sure that you will be able to pass your audit. As Walt says, the last thing you want are unnecessary audit findings. So my job is to help you avoid those. Okay, so we have about 60 slides, and can everyone see the slides? Catherine, are you okay there? Can you see the webinar?
Yes. Yes. It's
Great.
open.
Okay, so we're going to go into the cost principles. The first part of this is a little bit higher level as it tries to bring into perspective how the cost principles fit into your wider responsibility under your award. So I'm going to talk about here, you'll see on the slide, it talks about 2 CFR 200.400. I'll talk about the Code of Federal Regulations in a little bit, but that's actually where they come from. And that's something that you'll want to eventually be able to bookmark on your computer and even print out, certainly, and have access to those on a regular basis. Okay, so this first slide really is about what will be included in your cooperative agreement. This is a standard COAG, as they say. Attachment A, which I'm going to go to the next slide, as we're going to talk about here in a minute. That's the very detailed portion. Attachment B would be pretty much what your program is about. When you proposed, you said you could do certain things. Here's my team, here's my area, and that is generally what's put straight back into your agreement. Attachment C, I have in red. These are, for I think most people on the call, will be non-US mandatory standard provisions, or what are also called required as applicable provisions. And these are the provisions that go along with your award and the requirements for you to be compliant and extra things that are essentially taken out of the Code of Federal Regulations or the Uniform Guidance. Let's not worry about that right now. In the future, we could do additional, certainly, webinars on those provisions. And then finally, attachment D is normally your marking or branding on how you certainly use the USAID logo and let your recipients know that these goods are for the American people. Okay, so attachment A, also known as the schedule, is the highest level of your award, and this is where the agreement officer has crafted your award specifically for you with these special requirements, okay? And so the purpose of the cooperative agreement, what you're doing, how long it's going to go for, the amount, normally over 5 years, and then of course the budget there would be how much you're going to get over the 5 years normally, and then the other things. And I think Jason may be jumping in here in a little bit to talk about some of the reporting that he had briefly mentioned earlier. But the important point of this discussion is that this part of your award, this attachment A, is the most important part that you or someone in your organization has to read and understand. And I'd highly recommend you create a compliance person who's solely responsible, not solely, but extremely knows he or she's responsible for complying with all these requirements. Okay, so down here, we won't be talking about property and indirect costs and program income, but all these things are incredibly important that you read and follow these things. Okay, down under A14 here, special provisions. This could be where if you've had a NUPIS or some other review by omission, where they put in special provisions that they want you generally to fix before you get too far into your award. It could be weaknesses in timekeeping, travel, procurement, something like that. That would be in this sort of environment. And the rest of these things are just all very important. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, here is what Jason, I think, alluded to earlier. Jason, do you want to jump back in, or if you're happy, then I'll just...
Yeah, this is Callie. Sorry, Jason just stepped out, but I guess we mentioned this earlier, but we just want to emphasize again that what Doug is covering today in the webinar is the reporting that you are required to do under 2 CFR 200, which is distinct from the expenditure reporting that OGAC has also required PEPFAR partners to do. So I think that's all we need to say about it. Again, I'll reiterate that the expenditure reporting, which is distinct, we do have a lot of resources and trainings available on that as well. And we will share with this group those resources so that you can be up to date on what is required for expenditure reporting to OGAC. Okay, thanks, Doug. I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this slide is really about highlighting that which rules apply to you. And although it's an extremely short course or discussion, I think what you have to realize is, I'm going to go to the next slide here, this electronic code of federal regulations, which is really, we're going to talk about being the uniform guidance. Okay, this uniform guidance was designed for the 99.8% of the U.S. government money spent inside the states. Okay, USAID, although it still spends billions of dollars, is relatively small relative to the federal budget. Okay, so what I'm going to highlight here in a very quick way to say is, here we have USAID as the donor, and almost everyone on the call should be a non-US or a foreign prime. And what I say here is, what's important for you is what is in your award, right? Your award is there, okay? And this attachment C, which is the non-US mandatory standard provisions, that is basically a subset, or what we call a light version of the uniform guidance. Okay, so everything that is in the uniform guidance doesn't apply to non-US organizations. So it's important that you certainly read your mandatory provisions. And then notice I also say that it includes the 2 CFR 200, which are the cost principles. Okay, the cost principles apply to everyone, US orgs, non-US orgs, everyone. Every non-federal entity gets the same cost principles. Okay, so that's what applies to us, and this course is about the cost principles. And then I just have two sort of sub boxes. If you have a sub under you, or if you will have a sub, I'm just noting that what you will pass down to them are, again, the non-US mandatory standard provisions and the cost principle. And we'll leave it at that. It's a little bit more complicated if you have a US sub under you, like a university or an FHI type organization that is US based. Okay, but we can go there later. Okay, so what this slide explains is very briefly sort of how we got to the uniform guidance, and I don't want you to try to understand these things. What I'm highlighting, though, is that the boxes with the red X's are all old rules that used to apply that have all been incorporated into this new uniform guidance, which is the 2 CFR 200. Okay, that's also known as the UG, or Uniform Guidance. And then I have arrows coming down there going to notice the non-US, the red boxes, the non-US mandatory standard provisions and requires applicable. Okay, so that's what's important to the people on this call. Okay, possibly the cost principles are in here, 0.400, but the rest of it is basically these non-US mandatory standard provisions. Okay, that's what the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations look like. Just make a note, you go to ecfr.gov. At the top of the slide, you'll see that. And then you click on a few things. We don't have time to click through it, but you click here on 2, grants and agreements. That's for the 2 CFR. Then eventually you get down to 200, and that would be basically that's what you'd want to bookmark. And I'll show you slides later what you'd want to print out. Okay, so here I have an example of a typical health project that would have many of the types of things that you probably do. Okay, but the reality is there's only 55 specific cost principles, and many of these are not specifically included in there. So does this mean that you can't charge them or there's a problem with them? And the answer is no. The U.S. government, not just USAID, but the U.S. government pretty much plays by the rules that if a cost is reasonable, allocable, allowable, and not specifically unallowable. Okay, so we're going to talk about reasonable, allocable, allowable in a minute here. But unless the U.S. government says you cannot charge this cost, then it's possibly allowable, and frequently sometimes with prior approval. Okay, so we're not going to see things like necessarily treatment or workshops in the principles that we're going through today. Okay? Okay, so this is starting to come from the uniform guidance. Notice that the cost principles, as we say here, are used by all federal agencies, USAID included, that sponsor work performed by you. You're a non-federal entity and your subs. Okay, so the cost principles apply to you. Okay, so what we're going to cover is, very briefly, understanding the basic considerations, the reasonable, allocable, allowable, supported, that I talked about. And I've just given you the reference here where you would find this in the uniform guidance. Extremely briefly, direct and indirect costs, because those are themselves 1 or 2 day courses, but I want to have you understand when we talk about NICRAs, 10% de minimis, that would be covered in that area, and then the actual provisions of selected items, which is the rest of this course. Okay, so if you, basically I've taken a screenshot of what would be in the eCFR. This is what you would see when you get there. And so the basic considerations that we're going to cover are reasonable, allocable, and allowable in the next couple slides. Okay, so that would be there. Again, credits are rebates, which belong to the U.S. government. And then after that, I'll briefly, extremely briefly, talk about direct and indirect costs. That's what you would get. Actually, we won't even go there unless there's time at the end. Okay? So it's really all about reasonable, allocable, and allowable costs that you can charge to USAID on your project. Okay? That's what the section would look like. And when you get into the ecfr.gov, you would get here. And if you want, I would highly suggest printing these. And basically, you would just click on General Provisions, and then the details of all of these cost principles would pop up, and you'd print that, and that's what you'd use as your reference. Okay, so notice here, I'm going to say 421, we will include this one. We will talk about advisory councils. We will talk about alcoholic beverages, but we're going to miss a lot of these that aren't necessarily relevant to you or to today. So alumni activities, that's probably not too relevant to many of us. We're not institutions of higher education. And bonding costs in these, so we're not going to talk about all of these. It's just the ones that are most relevant and are likely to possibly get you in trouble in an audit. Okay, so the overarching principles. As an auditor, I will check that every cost you charge to the U.S. government is these 4 things, are reasonable, allocable, allowable, and supported. So let's jump into those. So here is the definition that comes from, notice 200.404, and I will go back there just to show you where it is. This comes from this reasonable here. If I clicked on that, I would get something that looks essentially this. Okay? And certainly there would be more. I'm just giving you the high level detail. But the concept on this slide is very important. It's called the prudent person rule. And what USAID wants you to be, the prudent person is someone who is careful. And we are all careful with our own money. When you get your paycheck, you know where that's going to go. It's going to go to food or rent or something, but we are very careful with our money. And the U.S. government and USAID especially want you to be just as careful with their money as you are with your own. Okay, so that's the prudent person rule. The second point here is you need to be prudent, and you have to document at the time you made the decision to incur this cost. Okay, now an audit can happen, so you've got basically that takes place. Many things can change in that time. So it's incredibly important to document why you made your decision to incur that cost.
Doug,
okay, so
sorry
reasonable.
to interrupt, but you went in and out a little bit on the audio, so I don't know if you're.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, I will slow down a little bit. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, so just one more time, reasonable. The concept is the prudent person rule, which means be as careful with USAID money as you are with your own. Okay. Other considerations here, I don't need to go through all of them, but the most important one are you should only charge a cost that you need for your project. So if we are doing male circumcision, you'll need those kits. If we're doing testing, of course, we need test kits. If we're doing orphans and vulnerable children, we might need beds or something like that. Okay. So, frequently people say, okay, well, I need a vehicle. Well, make sure you do need a vehicle. You have to justify that in your proposal. But certainly, unless you're working around the Lake District in Kenya, you might not need you don't necessarily need a boat. South Sudan, you might need a plane. Otherwise, don't buy a plane. Okay, so these are the things you justify your costs. That would be reasonable. Okay, the second portion is the second point I want to highlight is market prices for comparable goods. Okay, so remember that these rules were written for the bulk of the money that's spent in the states, and the important point about U.S. government money is competition. Okay, reasonable costs are generally competitive costs, so it's quite important for us to make sure we update our preferred vendor lists as soon as possible to be able to show the auditor or the government that we are being prudent in terms of having enough competition out there to give reasonable prices. Okay? This other individuals acting with prudence is not the prudent person rule. This is the good governance rule. Have you considered all of your stakeholders? And your stakeholders should be your organization, its employees, the people you are serving in the community, the U.S. government, and of course, the U.S. taxpayer. Okay? And finally, don't deviate from your established practices. Many organizations who become new partners, you are frugal, you are prudent, and the U.S. government says, please try to stay that way. Okay? If you're being careful, and all of a sudden you say, we can afford better vehicles, better per diems, better travel allowances, better everything, better pension, better savings plans. That's not what it's about. It's about trying to be as prudent as you were earlier. You can certainly change things, but we'll talk about that with prior approvals. Okay, so that was reasonable. Now, allocable here is extremely important. What costs can you allocate to your project and let the U.S. government and USAID pay for? Okay, so this is sort of the theory slide. Okay, so your project is a cost objective. A cost objective is something that is and a final cost objective, as we see, here's a project, which means you can allocate costs to it. You could have multiple projects, either U.S. government or other. You might have Gates Foundation or Global Fund. Those are also other cost objectives. They should pick up their own fair share of your costs. Okay, so here, this is the more detailed slide on allocability. In the first sentence, it's quite important to note consistent treatment. Okay, I want two different types of consistency as an auditor. I want to see consistent treatment between the different projects that I manage or that you manage. Okay, so if I've got a European Union or EU project, how much are we charging for a person who's an M&E person? I wouldn't want to see that too different from what you're charging the U.S. government project. And then consistency between years or periods. Okay, I don't want you to change your allocation methodology because all of a sudden we've got a big new $20 million U.S. government project, and well, let's let them pick it up. Okay, that's not the point. The U.S. government will pick up its fair share, but they don't want to pick up more than their fair share. Okay, so we have sort of three types of costs here. The first cost incurred specifically for the award. So again, if we've got, if we're supposed to manage 10,000 orphans or 1,000 orphans, then the only reason you need to buy beds is for this award. Okay, you may have different projects for different things, but the point here is it's quite specific, or male circumcision. If I've got to perform 10,000 circumcisions, I need 10,000 circumcision kits. It's also known as the but-for rule. But for this project, I would not have incurred this cost. Okay, so these also might be called direct costs. Okay, and those from an accounting point of view should be fairly straightforward. The second type of allocable cost is called joint and common costs. And this is a cost that you may have like rent, for example. So you may have one building where you operate multiple awards out of, and rent should be allocated on a reasonable basis to each project. Again, each project should pick up its fair share of that rent. And there could be many things like that. You might have possibly board fees that you have to incur. You might have to have HR costs. You might have IT costs, okay? And each project on some basis would pick up its fair share. So rent normally is picked up on a space basis, square footage, square meterage, where other costs, IT might be based on head count, HR on head count, maybe insurance allocated based on insurable assets, these sort of things, okay? So there's methodologies for that. And the third type, now in the class in Johannesburg that we had, many of the implementing partners and others were complaining that, guys, we're just not able to pick up our indirect costs. Okay, I believe many people aren't understanding this third bullet point. And the U.S. government's rule on this is if you must incur a cost to be in operation, so maybe an NGO fee in Ethiopia, or I must have a board, or I must have a statutory audit, because in our country that's a requirement. Those costs, again, the U.S. government will pick up their fair share, but only their fair share. So I think a lot of you possibly aren't considering that how to be able to recover these costs. And I just want to mention to the OFM guys, in the mandatory standard provisions, M1, it's not so clear that these type of costs are allowable. We talk about the direct costs and the second cost, allocable, but we don't necessarily clarify this third type of cost, which is, of course, an overarching cost principle. Okay? This slide is a little bit beyond the course, but I just want to highlight it's important. As I said earlier, every project picks up its fair share. And frequently, the NGOs, you will want to take money. You'll have like an Elton John Foundation who says, oh, we want to give you $500,000, but we just want it for direct costs. We don't want to pay overheads. Well, sorry, if they're not going to pay, if Elton John's not going to pay, who is going to pay? And the answer isn't the U.S. government. Okay, so every organization has to pick up their fair share. So, you know, don't take a project that doesn't come with adequate overheads, because it's not part of the deal with the U.S. government. Okay, and the final point here is each project comes with its own budget, and you should not be trying to move costs between your awards. Each award stands alone. Each award will be counted for alone, and so just be careful there not to say, oh, we've got a big new project here. Let's let that pick up all the rent or admin costs or something. Okay, that is allocability. Okay, finally, allowability. You'll see here it's 200.403, and I'm just going to be very high level here. So the first point of allowable is the costs have to be reasonable and allocable, and that's why we covered those first. Okay. So again, reasonable in amount, allocable to my award. So again, I got 1,000 orphans, I got 1,000 beds. That is possibly an allowable cost. Okay. There will be limitations in these cost principles that we're going to see now. And again, this consistent treatment that applies uniformly to both, again, USAID projects and our other activities. So again, one more time, I've got two M&E people. And my USAID M&E person, we pay $3,000 a month. Okay, then I go over and look at the other M&E person on the EU project, and we're only paying them $2,500 a month. And so again, as an auditor, I would say, why? That's inconsistent. And the answer isn't, well, we put $3,000 in the budget for USAID and they accepted that, okay? No, that's not how it works. It should be, if the M&E person is essentially equivalent, they should get the same amount of money. And the U.S. government doesn't pick up more of a project just because you put it in the budget. Okay, you can ask questions about that later, but that's very important. And I want to mention, as an auditor, you're thinking, why would I be talking about the EU project? Okay, when we're auditing your USAID project, we're not auditing the EU project. What we are looking for, though, is consistent treatment of how you have charged the U.S. government. And so we'll look at, did the EU pick up its fair share of rent? Did that project pick up the correct amount or the fair amount for the M&E example person? Okay, we're not auditing the EU project. We're looking for consistency. Okay, so finally, this consistent treatment here talks about consistent between direct and indirect costing, which is beyond this course. And you should generally try to treat costs consistently as direct or indirect. Okay, the final thing about allowability, there are certain times when you might get to depreciate things or amortization, and you generally be using certain accounting principles from your country that would be defined possibly by your auditors, such as buildings are depreciated over 20 to 40 years, or a generator over 3 to 5 years, or a vehicle 4 or 5 years, something like that. You'll see later on that depreciation is an allowable cost for the U.S. government. Right? And let's just skip F for now. And finally, document it, or as I said, reasonable, allocable, allowable, and supported. Again, if you incurred these costs, but you can't support it to the auditor, you say, no, we bought a generator and there it is and it's working, you can hear it. That's not enough, right? I want to see, how did you buy that? What procurement process did you go through? Okay, so it's going to be quite important. As Walt said, the last thing you want is your auditors having findings because you didn't document adequate how you bought the stuff or these items, reasonable, allocable, allowable. Okay, now I want to highlight here, this is actually the provision out of the mandatory standard division that I talked about earlier. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of these, just literally one of these, and this is where the provision says, okay, you recipients are responsible for making sure that the costs are reasonable, allocable, and allowable. Okay, and there's one point here that's quite important. This is it's been updated recently with the uniform guidance, and you should, like anyone, everyone should want things to be clear, that I put it in my budget and I know I can charge it to the U.S. government. But many times it's not going to be clear. And this is a clause that comes from, if you're writing down this, it's 2 CFR 200.407, and that's about prior approvals. And so USA thought this was so important, they put it in the very first provision. It basically says, if you're not sure about a cost, it's not in the cost principles, or we didn't include it in our original proposal, you have the option to get a written determination from your AO on, now I just want to, again, for the CFO folks or the OFM, it says allowability here and allocability in the provision. In the uniform guidance, it actually says reasonableness and allocability, okay? So you might just double check that because it's the reasonableness that an AO is supposed to be able to possibly opine or provide guidance on. Okay, but either way, recipients, the AO is your best friend. If you don't know, through the AOR, reach out to them to get certainty on this item. Okay? And just notice here, no funds will be paid as a profit to recipients. If you're going to have someone earning a profit, there will be a contractor, and you'll need a contract possibly under your award. That's beyond this course. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the various principles. As I've said, I think we certainly can't go over all of them, but the ones that we've seen people get in trouble for are these. Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a second to see if Jeff or anyone, has any specific hands up? Otherwise,
yes,
Catherine or anyone else?
We do have a question.
Great.
So I'm not going to try to say his name, but he's from the BPDO Ethiopia, and they are currently working with FAA HIV prevention, care, and treatment. What looks like the cost sharing report requirement, VAT treatment, and audit compliances. I'm not sure if that's a question.
Okay, well, cost share, let me just jump back there. Cost share is here under allowability, Now, cost share is where normally USAID says it's part of the sustainability initiative. And basically, as USAID gives us $10 million, generally your cost share could be, I've seen low as 5%, but generally it's 10%, certainly for a lot of non-PEPFAR projects. And that's where you are expected to come up with non-US government costs to support this project, your project. And so you'll see here this F, for a cost to be allowable, they cannot be included as cost share. Or basically, you can't use one US government's project to support another one. It's got to be someone else's money, OPM, other people's money. So cost share will normally come from maybe the government making available to you vehicles or clinics or doctors, or they provide the AR antiretrovirals, or possibly also the EU has a project that goes along, or anyone else, Gates Global. They all maybe have a project that supports this project. Then in those circumstances, that is your cost share.
Okay, they have some additional follow-on questions here about what does it mean to be adequately documented?
Okay, so to be documented, I want to see documentation that this expense occurred. Okay, normally if you buy something, I'd like to see the invoice. Depending on your processes and policies and procedures, we'll also test, did you follow your procedures towards a procurement? Okay, there's two things. As an auditor, there's two rules. You have to follow the US government rules, and you have to follow your own rules. Okay, so if your rules say we're going to do a procurement exercise and go get 3 quotes, that will be the sorts of things we'll test. So if your policy says for everything over X thousand dollars, we go get 3 quotes, then we'll look to see, did you do that? I'll look to see this. It's not in this course, it'll be in the mandatory provision course, but there's very specific rules on procurement. And if your policy says we get 3 quotes, then show me, did you get the 3 quotes? Did you put out the criteria for the evaluation? So the criteria could be, I need a generator, so it needs to be 100 kVA, it needs to be petrol, or it needs to be diesel, it needs to be whatever. And so we'll look to see, did you put out there for the potential vendor the specifications, and then is that in your files? Okay, the US government does not demand originals. A lot of times people say, oh, I got to have an original. You don't. Many times things are going digital now. So it doesn't have to be digital, but as an auditor, I'd like to see the process you went through to buy it. And certainly I want to see that you paid for it. And I want to see documentation that you received what you paid for. Okay, too frequently, people buy something and they get something else. Okay, so show me you got what you paid for. That's what documented is.
Okay, the other question is what makes the difference between fixed amount agreement versus the other types of agreements?
Okay, so a fixed amount award, I think they're talking about, is an old fixed obligation grant. A fixed amount award is a new, very helpful mechanism that a prime can use for a sub. A fixed amount award, if anyone sends me, there's 4 documents that we'd be happy to share with you, or you could get it certainly, possibly on the USAID website. But a fixed amount award is overseas, they are limited to 3 years and what's called the Simplified Acquisition Threshold, which is moving from 150 to 250. So it's basically like a baby sub-award, but it's very sexy in that it's not auditable, one, and you're paid based on milestones. So all the work gets done set up in the beginning to agree on the budget, but if you know every month someone's got to deliver you a report or some sort of activity, and you can break it into milestones, deliverables, then that should be an option. Fixed amount award is very useful. USAID can issue a fixed amount award of any size. Okay, and there's no limit to how many fixed amount awards you can have running. So you can break something into milestones, definitely consider a fixed amount award.
One follow-on question. Is there any difference between fixed amount award and cooperative agreement financial reporting?
Yes. A fixed amount award, all the work is done up front. So you sit down, and again, there's files on this that USAID provides. I could do it as well afterwards. But basically, you do the work up front. So you try to calculate how much should it cost to prepare this report each month. Now, that might be based on originally estimates of time and things. But once you fix that, then it's not audited, okay? It's just, I delivered the report. Let's say it's going to cost $10,000 a month. And so you agree up front for the next 12 months, this fixed amount award is for 12 monthly reports, $10,000 each. Boom. End of July or January, the guy delivers a report, they get the $10,000. Okay? There is no, you don't have to provide, it's not auditable. It's called not determinable. Okay? All the work is done up front. But these fixed amount awards must be approved by your prior approval from your agreement officer. And they may want to look at the diligence you went through to set that fixed amount award up. Okay? Why don't we save these, maybe any other questions for the end, because those are very good questions, and I'd like to get through. There could be some additional ones. I just want to ask Jeff or Catherine, how much more time do we have to pace myself? Because we're going to try to get through these. I think I have about 25 minutes.
Exactly. And there is one more question that I don't think got read with the example about salary differences.
Yeah.
Did we do that one? No.
No, salary differences. I will talk about compensation in a little bit here. Maybe they want to wait to that for compensation.
Okay.
Salaries.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but one point there, I think it may have been about the budget. Just because you put something in the budget does not mean the agreement officer approved that for reasonableness, okay? The budget is just about, when you put it in the budget, when USAID approves that budget, what they generally play by is that cost is allowable, not reasonable, not allocable, okay? It's the auditor's job to test it for reasonableness and allocability. So too frequently, people put in, I put it in the budget, therefore I can charge it. That's not true. We'll talk about reasonableness later on in terms of especially salaries. Okay, too frequently, people say, oh, I put it in the budget, that's okay. It's not okay, unless your AO specifically approved and you specifically ask for proof or acceptability of reasonableness. So literally, let's just go back here, right? That third bullet point, for costs not clearly included, but you're not sure, you can get a determination on its reasonableness and allocability. Okay, but an AO cannot say in year one that X $1,000 for rent is reasonable. What they can say, or allocable, what they can say is the methodology for allocating rent is based on square foot or meterage. Okay, that would be determinable. They're not going to be able to say now in year one, X so much is going to be allocable. And possibly likewise for reasonableness, because inflation and other things. Okay, so we might be able to come back to that. Okay, so advertising, public relations costs, they're very specific here on what you can charge here. So later on, we'll talk a little bit about recruiting, but frequently, if we're going to buy things, okay, then we may need to advertise, possibly, of, yes, we need a generator, or we need something else, or we need staff, or other things. That might go out on a website, or it might go out into a newspaper, or something like that. That would be that type of procurement. And the new point in advertising is program outreach. And this generally comes when we're buying airtime. You know, maybe we have to have public outreach for 1-minute radio spots and things like that. And so you have to buy media time, and that would be an allowable quote unquote advertising cost. Okay, as we're going to see on the next slide, nothing else is allowable under advertising and public relations. Okay, we frequently don't see too much public relations costs, but I would say if your project is all about success, how many HIV babies how many babies are born HIV free? PMTCT. How many orphans graduated from high school? How many successful male circumcisions? Communicate that performance if you can. Everyone wants to see success, and certainly that's what you would have here under public relations. Okay, here, this list says pretty much everything else is not allowable. So please be careful about so calendars, cufflinks, all the possible, coffee mugs and stuff, not allowable. Okay. Now, people frequently ask, how about hats and shirts? Okay, hats and shirts, if they're specifically part of the program, they may be allowed, but it's got to be about the program on the front of the shirt, such as I know my status, okay, or I've been tested, or whatever the program's about. Okay, your logo and USAID logos goes on the shoulders, but certainly the front is about the program. Likewise, for all these pull-up stands we have that promote programs, it's got to be about the program. Your logo at the bottom. So anything to promote your organization specifically is not allowable. You're promoting the project. Okay, advisory councils. Okay, the only reason I incorporate this is for the OFM and OAA guys to discuss. And what it says here, costs for advisory councils, where possibly you have to recognize an authoritative person in a village or society, and he or she represents authority. They're the chief or the leader or whatever, the respected official. There could be sometimes certain activities which you have to recognize that. Okay. Notice here, though, it is only allowable as an indirect cost. Now, this is quite important because historically this was allowable as a direct cost. Okay. And recipients, we don't have a lot of time to get into this, but frequently, if someone says just direct cost everything, then if your AO tells you to direct cost it, well, then direct cost it. But I do want to say to the OFM people and OAA, we checked this a little while ago with South Africa. We had multiple AOs in the room, and I asked them, do you AO have authority to overrule the cost principles? They weren't sure. They checked with Steve Tashian, and he said no. He said an AO cannot demand things be charged directly. So I think we have to be a little careful here that when we tell people just direct cost everything, and that's possibly what they may want to use their 10% de minimis for these types of costs. But we certainly say to the auditors, if the agreement officer told them to direct cost it, that's acceptable. But you might just want to double check that on your side. Okay, alcoholic beverages, not allowable. Okay, just be clear. It doesn't matter how cheap that bottle of Johnny Walker was, it's not allowable. It's not going to be allocable. It never will be. Audit costs, related services. Okay, the U.S. government is going to require, as Walt said, if you spend more than $750,000 in your fiscal year, you will have what we call a yellow book audit. It's a generally accepted government auditing standard audit that is conducted overseas, and we could have a whole course on that. But that, of course, that's an allowable cost. One more time, but for this project, you would not have had this special U.S. government audit. The second bullet point, though, is it would be, I would say, for discussions with the agreement officer. But recipients, remember, so if you have to have a statutory audit, your normal Ethiopian, Nigerian, Kenyan audit, then if you must have it, then the U.S. would, in theory, pick up its fair share of that. But please make sure you must have it. Some people have these statutory audits, but they're not a requirement. So the U.S. government would say, if you didn't have to have it, you shouldn't have incurred it. Okay, I'll leave this at that. Bad debts, unallowable. Why should USAID pick up your bad debts? Okay, please try not to have bad debts and be careful in how you spend the money. And then again, once you start going after, once you know it's a bad debt, all the time and effort you go to collect that bad debt will not be allowable either. So please work hard not to have it, and then once it's done, unfortunately, you may get stuck with that cost.
Doug?
Okay, communication. Yeah.
We just have two things I don't want you to get too far away from. They want to know which cost principles are commonly violated, and also the principle that you talked about, will that also work for FAA?
Okay. Well, cost principles, the most common finding is people have improper timekeeping. Okay, and one of those that we'll talk about in a minute here is people charge budget versus actual. Okay, and you just cannot. Okay, you must charge actual time. And so if we sit there and look at a timesheet and you're working on, two projects, one EU project and one USAID project, then I see you charge every day 2.5 hours to EU and 4.5 to USAID or 3.5, whatever. I know you're not charging actual time. Okay? That would be a pretty common finding. And people are going to say, well, I don't know, I don't want to go under budget. There's huge flexibility in what you can charge. Don't worry about being over or under any day or month or even year. Obviously, everyone can't be overtime for the entire period, but there's huge flexibility in your timekeeping. That's a very common problem, time. They possibly travel, also we could talk about, but let me think more about that as we go. Okay, Jeff, sorry, the second question was on fixed amount awards, and okay, so yeah, fixed amount award, certainly the concepts would be the same cost principles. The thing is they're not determinable or not audited. So that's why it's so important you get it right up front. And I would believe that the agreement officers would look at your justification for using that fixed amount award, and there are budget templates available. Okay, so the justification is correct cost. You're not going to have, we just talked about alcohol. You're not going to have alcohol paid under a fixed amount award. It wouldn't be allowed. Bad debts wouldn't be there. Entertainment's not going to be there. Okay, they will look at those, the build up to that fixed amount award. Okay, communications costs. This used to actually be specifically in the cost principles A7 under the A122, not for profit, but it's no longer there. And so people say, as we say, if it isn't included, does that mean we can't do it? And the answer is no. Possibly any cost can be allowable if it's reasonable, allocable, allowable, and not specifically, of course, supported, and not specifically disallowed. So many of us need communications costs. We have people out in the field, they need data to communicate, share their findings and their results, okay? But they don't have to have specifically have a cost principle for communications anymore. As an auditor, I will look to your budget to see, did you clearly put this in the budget? And okay, so a community care worker needs $10 a month for communications or Wi-Fi costs. Great, that seems reasonable. But I don't want to see the 100 field workers getting $10 a month and the chief of party getting $500 a month because she or he is the leader. Okay, if they don't need the communications costs, they shouldn't be charging it. Okay, so this is one of those things that you could specifically ask your AO, dear AO, okay, I've got 100 community care workers. We believe X dollars a month is reasonable. What do you think? And under the AO, they have many, sometimes A&A specialists that have worked in your country for many years. They'll know, and they'll work with the AO to say, yeah, that seems fair. Okay. Also, the auditors will weigh in at the end of the year whether they thought it was fair. Okay, compensation for personal services, 430. Normally in a class we would spend a half hour here. I'm going to only spend a few, but this is quite important. So you'd want to go to your cost principles. There's a few things you need people who are specialists at in your organization for additional knowledge. And one of them is certainly compensation, one's procurement, one's travel. Okay, so this certainly compensation, have someone who specializes in this. But basically, you can charge the U.S. government for salaries, fringe, incentive, pension, to the extent only that they are reasonable in amount. We've talked about that. Follows an appointment. This is new. The second bullet point is important. It follows an appointment made in accordance with local laws, meaning follow the laws of the HR laws of your country. Okay, and thirdly, documented, determined, and supported, which essentially means timesheets. Okay, so it's going to be important, those three things. So reasonable, and this gets back to the question on salaries. As I say, I want to see, I will look as an auditor to see, you're charging USAID X thousand dollars for an M&E person, how much are you charging the EU? Okay, similar activities for similar work should get similar pay. And again, one more time, just because you budgeted USAID $5,000 for the M&E guy, okay, if they're not worth $5,000, I'm not saying they're not worth $5,000 just because of anything they're doing. If you can get away with $3,000, if the EU person's getting $2,500, why can't USAID get the $2,500 person? Let the EU pick up the $5,000. And if your answer is budget, that's the wrong answer. That's not reasonable. Okay. The second point is the labor market decides what is a fair amount. Okay. Frequently you'll have salary surveys, but if you don't, I think there's three types of labor markets. One is the private sector, which tends to pay the highest. Second would be international NGOs, which have a pretty rich compensation plan, travel, pension, savings plans, medical plans. That's quite rich. The third type is a local NGO, which most of the people on the call is, right? And again, be frugal, be prudent. Hey, you won't have at the beginning pension plans, savings plans, medical plans for everyone. Okay? So again, you can't say, well, FHI pays this or World Vision pays this, because that's not your labor market. In most markets, there's a lot of hungry people out there and competent that will fight to get to be part of your organization. That's the level you want to peg it at. Okay, incentive compensation, you just got to be careful here. I'm just cognizant of time. You just got to be careful here. It has to be benefit the project. Cost reduction, increased performance. It's got to be reasonable. That's not defined anywhere, but through interactions with USAID, I would say more than 10%, you're going to get a fight. And finally, you got to reach what that incentive is about before they started. You can't get to the end of the year and say, we all did well, you all get an incentive, because that's not incentive, okay? You got to be able to say, if your target is managing 100 orphans, and if now that's normal, you can manage 130, great. Maybe you're worth an extra 5 or 10%. That's what that's about, before performance. Okay, then finally, this is the most important section in terms of what we would need. And just make a note if you're taking notes. This would be 430 point Roman numeral I, okay? And basically, all of these things scream timesheet without saying it anywhere, okay? And so basically, to charge the salaries and wages to your project, and the most common line item is salaries and wages, you have to make sure that your supporting documentation reflects what your people did. And these records must, and that's a must mean we're going to test this, okay? You need a system of controls which make sure you can charge reasonable, allocable, and accurate amounts to that project. You're allocating salary. Now, of course, if a guy works 8 hours a day on the project, that's very straightforward. But if he or she worked part-time on the project, that's what I care about, the allocability of the correct amount into two USAID projects. Okay? This one relates to this bullet point here, total activity for which the employee is compensated. Many of you say, well, if they're working on 2 projects, why does USAID care about what they do on the other project? To be honest, they really don't care about the other person's time. This is more, to be honest, having to do with being able to calculate the NICRA, which is beyond this course. Okay, they just need to know what costs are direct costs and which costs are indirect. Okay, so it's beyond this course, but USAID isn't trying to snoop on what you're doing for the EU or Global Fund. Okay, so this final bullet point encompasses both federally assisted, meaning a USAID project, and other activities compensated by you on an integrated basis. So one timesheet, 8 hours a day, we want to know what your guys did. Okay, we don't have the time. This is just more saying that this third bullet point is where I estimate, I highlight budget estimates do not qualify as support. Okay, you cannot charge budget. For interim purposes, you can, but then you must true up or reconcile at the end of the month for on a certain period. Okay, fringe benefits are allowable, but make sure you are allocating each project its fair share. Okay, so I don't want to see, great, USAID has a pension plan and family and sick leave and all this, and the Elton John Foundation, well, people on that don't get anything. Or people who don't work on the project but only work for your NGO who aren't project specific, they get nothing. Oh no, but here we're charging USAID for all this stuff because they'll pay for it. Okay, that's not fair, that's not equitable. And just on this fringe benefit for here, severance payments at the end of a project, your people will possibly be terminated. I'm just going to highlight here that for you to be able to charge severance payments, in many countries it's a certain period per year of service. For example, in South Africa, 1 week of severance payment for year of service. You have to make sure that those costs are necessary in your country and approved by USAID and normally your AO. Okay, so many things will require prior approval. I'll leave it at that. That's what that 407 comes in. Conferences, be careful here. The new twist here is you must exercise discretion and judgment. Okay, so no more projects happening, no more conferences in the 6-star hotels, no more Las Vegas, no more Disneyland. No, you want conferences in a very frugal place. Remember that prudent person rule. Contingency, we'll go past this one, we don't have time. Okay, claims files, you must follow the rules of your country and follow the rules of the U.S. government. If those are going to conflict, talk to your AO up front. Okay, but the whole point is if you need to follow the rules. If you don't, that's your problem. So learn your rules, learn the U.S. government rules, follow the rules. Depreciation, if you own your own assets, you own your building, your vehicles, your equipment, okay? You've owned them, you didn't pay for them with U.S. government funds, you can charge the U.S. government for depreciation of that. It used to be called a use charge, okay? That's why I said earlier, you need to possibly have a logical basis for your building or equipment and things, okay? So you can charge depreciation. If you didn't have to pay for the asset, you didn't buy a vehicle. You're using your own, U.S. government will pay a depreciation charge. Health and welfare costs, allowable. Keep your people healthy. Okay, so you might have mental health days, you might have days where people come in to test blood pressure and diabetes and stuff. Okay, those costs would be allowable. Under the new cost principles, morale is no longer specifically allowed. So that would be something you'd ask your AO. Can we have a day of team building? That would be a classic thing, get prior approval. Entertainment, not allowable unless you need that entertainment for programmatic purposes. So if you want to get 10,000 youths into a stadium to hear an HIV/AIDS message, no amount of talking by the doctor is going to do it. You might get the local DJ, and he or she will play for an hour. At the break, you'll get the message out by the doctor trying to communicate about the HIV program or whatever it is, and that is allowable entertainment. But that same entertainer at your Christmas or Diwali or Eid party, not allowable. Equipment capital expenditure, this is just the definition on this page. I just want to highlight to the agreement officers in here. Notice general purpose equipment, okay, is listed here. Vehicles are listed as general purpose equipment. And the rules under general purpose equipment is general purpose equipment are unallowable as a direct cost, except with prior approval. So many times people have a vehicle and charge it directly. So in theory, they need AO approval to charge that as a direct cost. Although frequently AOs will allow the vehicle, they don't specifically mention it's allowable as a direct cost. I'll leave this at that. Exchange rates, possibly. If your exchange rate goes against the dollar, meaning it gets stronger, it's possible that you can reach back to your AO, probably through your AOR, to say, look, we don't have the funds anymore because my currency is strengthened, my award's in dollars, I need more funding. Okay, unlikely, but possible. Okay, fundraising, investment management, not allowed. And you're saying, you asked us to be sustainable, but you're not paying for it. That's true, okay? So just be careful here, but fundraising is when you're going for unrestricted funds. Once you have a specific purpose for a budget, that isn't necessarily fundraising, that would be proposal costs, which are allowable as indirects. We'll get there later, okay? So be careful. If someone who's working the phones to say, dear corporate, we need X thousand dollars, or can you please support us, that is not going to be allowed. Personal use or services, not allowed. Don't use the copy machine for your kids' homework. Don't use the project vehicle on weekends. Don't use, whatever in the office for personal use. The reason the U.S. government makes those available is for the project. Leave it at that. Okay, lobbying, not allowable. Now, there's a difference between lobbying and advocacy. Advocacy is when your project attempts to influence legislation for someone else's benefit. So yes, we are advocating for nurses to strike, or to have work less than 60 hours, or mothers to have access to something. That's advocacy. Lobbying is when you're trying to influence legislation for your organization's behalf. That's not allowable. Losses in other contracts or awards, not allowable. Each award stands alone. So auditors, we're going to talk about a fund accountability statement for each project. Each project has its own income and expenditure and budget. Okay? Don't start matching and don't try to shift costs between projects. Maintenance and repair, allowable. Okay, U.S. government, maybe they've bought the vehicle, and so your job is to repair it, upkeep, get it serviced, get the generator serviced on a regular basis. Auditors will be checking the logs. Get your car checked every 20,000 Ks, or get the generator checked every 100 hours of operation or something. Okay, that's your job. And chances are, at the end of the project, you'll probably end up keeping the asset anyways, so why not maintain it? Okay, materials and supplies, all the things we need, the reagents, the test kits, all that's going to be allowable, but be careful, try to treat them as direct costs if you can. Okay, if you can say, I need these reagents for this project, try to treat that as a direct cost. Otherwise, you might have to use your 10% de minimis that we are not going to have time to talk about, but that would be your overhead costs, which you could dig into your, what we'll say, your allowable overheads. Okay, membership subscriptions. If you need to pay, possibly, you have doctors, you pay for the medical association, maybe your accountants are part of the AIC or the CPA society or whatever. If they're a professional, maybe your nurses, maybe your M&E people, if they belong to a professional organization, that is an allowable cost. But the question, is it allocable? I want to see that doctor is working as a doctor on the project. I don't want the doctor to be working as an accountant on the project. That wouldn't, he or she has to be doing the profession that you're paying for the fees. Okay, participant support costs are allowable with prior approval. So what happens is out of those 10,000 youth in the stadium, you say, okay, I'm looking for 100 participants to help be community care workers, and they stick around, and now you're going to teach them for a week to be community care. You'll pay their stipends, maybe a little bit of fees. You're going to pay for subsistence to get back and forth, but they're not employees, okay? And this all comes with prior approval of your agreement officer, prior written approval. Okay, finally, not finally, but close plant security costs are allowable. Protect your people, protect your assets, protect your data. Okay, we haven't talked, we don't have a lot of time, but there's a lot of sensitive information we have, and make sure, if nothing else after this course, talk to your IT guys, saying, guys, are we protecting the information? Very sensitive who's positive, very sensitive how people vote or who they support, very sensitive if they're LGBT. Many countries, you don't want people to know that people are LGBT or HIV positive. That's sensitive. Protect that information dearly. Professional service costs. So in addition to the procurement process, that's quite substantial, okay? If you are buying your auditors or your lawyers or some specialists, there are additional requirements to make sure these costs are allowable. And the whole point is, did you really have to hire that specialist? Because it's going to cost you. There's no doubt they're going to cost you more than an employee. So they're going to ask you, did you have to contract it out, or couldn't we have done it internally? And the answer is generally, let's take your audit, no. No amount of genius doctors can perform a yellow book audit. Okay, that's just not their thing. Okay, so the whole point is under professional service costs, I want to see as an auditor a contract that describes what are they doing, how much time did it take, show me the budget, at what rates. That's going to help determine that cost allowability. Okay, proposal costs, we're almost done here. I think we have 2 more slides. Proposal costs are allowable only as indirect costs. Okay, so this is why generally organizations have the NICRA, the negotiated indirect cost rate, or this is like what you might use the 10% de minimis for. And certainly for OFM and the OAA guys, we've done a white paper on the 10% de minimis. You might find interesting. Okay, but the whole point of the 10% de minimis is to enable recipients who can't get a NICRA or who just aren't competent enough to calculate it to cover costs like this. Okay? Recruiting, yes, if you can recruit, you got to go find people, but just be careful, be very prudent on how we recruit people these days. Okay, don't hire headhunters. Possibly you might have a recruiter for nurses or doctors or accountants, but I don't want to see headhunting for a data capture. Okay, and certainly if you're relocating people, USAID will pay for the relocation, but if that person quits within 12 months, USAID is not going to pick up the cost of relocation. So if you're going to move someone, make sure they're going to stick with your organization. Yeah, that's relocation costs. Here, rental costs, U.S. government will pay their fair share, but not more than this. So I want to see, you're going to say, oh, yes, I have a very nice place. Do you really need that nice of a place? Okay? Rule of thumb, never have nicer offices than the U.S. government, right? So if you can go see what the mission offices look like, that's the maximum you're going to get. You don't want your AOR coming in saying, these are really nice offices. They're nicer than ours. You don't want to hear that, right? Be frugal, be prudent. Just get enough to get by of your rent. Taxes are allowable if you cannot avoid them. Okay? If you can avoid them, you must. So for example, value-added tax here, in many countries, you pay VAT, 10, 12, 14%, and then you get it back. So this will be a reconciling item on your financial statements, okay? But if you can't get that VAT back, if you can't get certain taxes back, like your customs fees, then they will be allowable. But you better be able to prove to your auditor, we couldn't get the money back. Termination costs, this is one more slide after this. Termination is allowable, but within reason. Certainly, when your project closes out, you're not going to turn off every cost on that closeout day. Okay? You're going to have some leases that you have to close down, possibly your insurance, possibly your technology costs. Okay? But try to close out as a process. Try to plan for a closeout and have a plan 6 months in advance, and then work to the plan. Try to close out your costs as fast as possible. Okay? Training and education are allowable, but remember, training for the project. The accountant gets trained in finance. The doctor gets trained in something medical. I don't want to see a doctor charging for underwater photography. Okay? That's got nothing to do with the project. Travel costs are allowable, but assume you're going to be traveling in economy class unless very specific circumstances. So again, you need a specific person to understand travel costs. The federal travel regulations are quite significant. You need a guy who can do this. Okay, and finally, the last slide is trustees. Okay, trustees or directors are allowable. Okay, and normally the standard rule of thumb around the world is, okay, generally we expect people to have a board. We expect that board to meet. They have compliance, to good governance, a part of our internal control structure, okay? So they have to get there, and they have to be meaningful when they get to the board meeting, okay? So if they're gonna be paid at all, the maximum normally is 2 hours of preparation time for every sitting hour of board time. That's a general good standard, okay? But preferably, your directors will be, they're not charging you, but certainly their travel to get to the board meeting, their subsistence costs are allowable. Okay, that is it. So I'll turn it back over to any questions.
Oh boy, do we have a lot of questions here.
Great.
They have one question says that they own a building that they don't pay rent on, but they have USAID programs operating from this building, but the projects are not being charged for office space. Can we have more guidance on charging depreciation and acquisition costs? We have not done it before, but guidance would be useful.
Okay, well, if you own the building, then again, you're using that building for the project. So USAID would, that's under depreciation, and that is one of the cost principles. So go there and read it in the 2 CFR 200.4 something, probably, again, they're alphabetical. Depreciation is an allowable cost. So, but how much? How much of that space are you using? So that will be an allowable cost, yes.
Okay, the other question related to that is how do they calculate depreciation?
Okay, well, depreciation, that would be part of the discussion that we said for reasonable, allocable, allowable, and that is, as we say here, okay, so depreciation would be a part of your allowability, okay, as we say here, E, determined in accordance with generally accepted principles. So normally buildings are depreciated between 20 and 40 years, depending on your country. So I would say, 40 years would be the most conservative. I'm not saying it'd be accelerated to do it under 20, but if you have a B or C grade building, and the other thing about if you're charging, well, again, you're going to charge, you would charge, right, that's what you can charge, depreciation. So I would say if the building is whatever worth it's worth, I can't say, but say, great, I'm going to depreciate it. Let's say if the building's worth $1 million and you're going to depreciate it over 20 years, that's, I think, $50,000 a year. So, if the U.S. government is using half of that building, I would say $25,000 would be an adequate depreciation charge. I'm subject to, I'd want to see the details. Okay.
Okay, the BPDO in Ethiopia says that USAID is highly working for capacity building activities for LIPs. So why fundraising activities are unallowable costs if it is shared fairly among all BPDO projects? This is because one of the activities within capacity building.
Yeah. Well, I can't speak for the U.S. government. It always has been not allowed. So fundraising and investment management. So, the whole point is, remember, sustainability is quite important for organizations. We can do a class on sustainability. But again, the U.S. government is not going to be there forever. Look at USAID's website. Their goal is to put themselves out of business, to develop organizations to help themselves. So cost share is one of those things, and certainly fundraising. Again, you're trying to so you should go out and get these extra costs for what we call rainy day money. Okay, but it's not for necessarily program-specific costs. They're not asking you to go raise money for the project. USAID generally is going to pay for that. It's the cost share component, which would be the 10% that you may have to come up with. But they're not asking you to go find 90% of the project's costs.
So Doug, let me add to that question. Let me add to that answer. So within ASAP, we do have as one of our objectives to help local organizations with sustainability and business development. So we will be providing training and resources and guidance on how an organization should get itself established in terms of knowing what the donor landscape is like, with some templates for writing proposals, some ideas, how they can write their own content. But we will not be writing proposals with the NGOs. We're just going to be giving all of the NGOs the opportunity to learn about best practices, things that international NGOs have learned over the years, to get more money from donors, as well as local resources.
Great, thanks, Catherine. I don't know, can you still see my slides, or have we turned that off yet?
No, there's slides are still on.
So as we say here, the first bullet point, it costs for fundraising for basically for unrestricted funding is allowable. You'll see the second bullet point, fundraising for the purposes of meeting the program objectives are allowable with prior approval. Okay, so I think that could be something that needs to be handled offline, but talk to your AO. But generally, that might be the cost share concept of your, probably normally your 5 or 10%.
Okay, next question is how many percent allowable change in expenditure with cost items?
Sorry, one more time on that?
How many percent is allowable change in expenditure with cost items?
Okay, so the allowable budget change is 10% of the total amount of the budget. So you're talking about the 5-year budget. Okay, this is in the mandatory standard provision. So if you have let's just to keep it simple, the accounting. If you have a 5-year award for $10 million, $2 million a year, you can change your direct cost line items, meaning between salaries and program and maybe travel. You can change up to 10% of that 10 million, which is $1 million, without prior approval from the agreement officer, which is a lot of flexibility. Okay, it's not 10% per budget item, it's 10% of the total budgeted amount of the entire program. So there's huge flexibility. Okay, but you might want to justify it just to the agreement officer to explain why you're doing it, or the AO, because they may want to know. But the federal rule is 10%.
What about cost of living adjustment costs?
Well, that depends on the reasonableness. Cost of living, remember, that's a good one. Okay, you can talk about the contract side or cooperative agreements. We're on the cooperative agreement side. Basically cost of living, put it this way, do you have to pay that guy the cost of living? We say, well, inflation's 5%, a year increase, and therefore I'm going to give 5% plus, 2% for, good performance. That's a 7% increase. I mean, do you need to do that every year? I mean, a performance evaluation criteria, and I don't think, I hate to say it, I hate to be the auditor in the room, but, everyone doesn't always deserve cost of living increases. Put it this way, if you've got people 60% unemployment in certain countries, people will do that job for less. So I think a lot of people need to realize, they should be happy with their job. And I think management and the HR department has to justify all the time if they're just going to give cost of living plus. It could be a bit rich.
What about the cost of lawyers?
Okay, the cost of lawyers to protect the U.S. government is allowable. So you need to hire a lawyer because possibly you're taken to court because you catch the guy stealing. So he or she's stealing, and so you're protecting the U.S. government funding. That's allowable. Hire a lawyer to sue the U.S. government is not allowable. And as we said, to hire a lawyer to protect something that you did wrong, right? You should have paid taxes, you didn't, and then you need a lawyer to go to the tax court. That's not going to be allowable either.
Is VAT allowable?
VAT is allowable if you cannot avoid it. So frequently, again, you normally, VAT in this country is 15%. So I'm going to buy something for $100 and I pay the 100 plus the 15 VAT, and then I'll file my VAT return and hopefully get that money back. If I get back the 15, which would be the norm, then of course you can't charge that to the U.S. government. If I'm never going to get it back, in some countries they have a VAT system, quote unquote, but you just never get it back, then talk to your auditor, talk to the A&A assistants who help the AO, talk to the OFM team, the controller's office about that. But generally, try to get the VAT back.
What about the cost of marketing and IT costs?
Marketing, well, what are we marketing here? If part of the program is to market, condoms or something like that, if it's only part of the program, yes. Marketing the organization, no. IT costs, if we need IT for the program, yes. So people need computers, people need, you need web addresses, you need cell phones to communicate, you need tablets to upload your M&E data. That is allowable. But I want to see, is it, certainly IT is potentially allowable, is it allocable? Am I only using that tablet for this project? Okay, is it my personal cell phone that I'm using, or is it the company cell phone? Again, you don't want to use the company cell phone for personal use. So, some of these things come into play here, but there's nothing wrong with IT costs. There's certainly an allowable type cost.
If an organization includes house allowance as staff benefit package in its administrative policies and procedures, how do you understand the USAID, the allowability of this cost?
Okay, I mean, the question is a couple of things here. Is it just part of that person's package, sort of like what you call a smorgasbord option? So I get whatever, I get the $10,000, well, I get the $5,000 a month. It's up to me, do I use that for housing or whatever else? Or it might be part of the package, saying, okay, your package of $5,000 includes housing allowance or whatever else. I would look to see one thing for consistency. First of all, again, does anyone else get the same thing? So if someone else gets 4 or 5 their salary and no housing, and for the same type of person, let's take our M&E person again, but the USA guy gets 5,000 because an extra 500 in there for a housing allowance, that's not consistent treatment, okay? So you got to be a little careful when you're talking about these benefits, okay? Certainly there's nothing wrong with fringes. Management can have a different fringe benefit package than the staff. If the cleaners and the security guards and the drivers don't have to have the same fringe package. But I do want to see consistency, and I certainly want to see the written policy. Okay, so fringes are certainly something to take a little bit of discussion. But read it. It's 431, cost principle 431, fringe benefits.
Okay, we just have time for just a few more. From Uganda, kindly clarify whether board member sitting allowance costs are allowable costs.
Okay, a couple questions. Is it normal and natural in the country? They're not specifically disallowed, so that means they're potentially allowable if they are reasonable and allocable. Okay, reasonable in Uganda, we just did training there recently. I believe those are, people do charge for certain fees. Now, again, many countries, it's not normal for an NGO to have to pay. So I try to, you'd have to convince your auditor, did you have to pay this guy? I mean, is he or she that valuable that you must pay them? We did see that their travel time, their subsistence allowance, or per diems to come to the thing are certainly allowable, but I would want to see, did we truly have to pay that person? Okay, and then, so is it allowable? It's certainly not disallowed. And then the question, is it normal in that country that people do get paid for directorships or trusteeships?
If a COP funds must be spent until September of the fiscal year, can the IP make payments to vendors and complete the activities after September if the contract is still valid?
Okay, so assuming this is not a closeout period, because you have some unique things in a closeout period, I think the question is, were those funds obligated and committed on whatever, September 30? So for example, the audit, let's say their organization, their audit year end is September.
And so they're not going to have the audit until after the end of that project. So again, are they on a cash, are they on a cash or accrual basis? Most people are on a cash basis. So I think the bottom line is if you have to commit to pay for an audit, I don't think it truly matters for USAID, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong here from the AO side or the program side. You need to have the audit. It's an allowable cost. You have it for year X, year 1 or 2 or 3. You're incurring it in the next year. I don't think there's a problem with that. The closeout period, possibly. In those periods, you certainly have to get a commitment and obligation to spend those funds within a certain 90-day period. Be careful in the closeout periods.
If the USAID program participates in USAID promotional events, can we print out program promotional calendars or other stuff like this with the USAID logo?
Sure. Okay, that one I'd get prior approval. Okay, calendar. I mean, you're going to have a picture of a wildlife or a flower or something else? I mean, what does that have to do with the program? Once the guy turns over the cover and the calendar, you're probably not getting the program anymore. I would probably think, even with the USAID logo on the bottom, with the organization logo, I would doubt it. I would think you'd get specific approval for that one.
Under fringe benefit, is covering the cost of annual leave allowable?
Okay, so annual leave, most people do get annual leave. That's most people, it's required in many countries to have 2 or maybe 3 weeks annual leave. So that would be a part of their normal package. So yes, I would say it's allowable as part of the package. And it should be in their contract. It should be in the organization's policies and procedures that we do recognize our national requirement. We do pay out. Again, be a little bit careful at the end of the project that how we possibly carry over or charge the U.S. government for untaken leave time. But yes, leave is an allowable cost, allowable fringe benefit.
Doug, what about the cost for renovating health clinic buildings where the project is providing health services? Basic renovations such as filling in cracks in the building. Reasons for the renovation is to ensure safety of staff and clients and preventing loss of project assets.
Okay, yeah, we got to be a little bit careful here separating construction from making it fit for purpose. So frequently, if it's an HIV project and you're either doing TB, you might put up those big plastic sheets along to separate people with TB from those not. But if you're building ramps and knocking down walls and that, you need to get specific line item under construction. Okay, that's covered in the mandatory standard provisions under construction. So the bottom line is if you're going to have construction, you will want to talk to your AO. And so just think about that if you're proposing, that's the stuff you want to think about in your original proposal. You're thinking, this building isn't going to work for us. So I'm going to put in, and then specifically put in, we're going to need X thousand dollars for construction. And your AO will build in a line item for possibly construction. But generally, the U.S. government doesn't like bricks and mortar. Okay? Could you find another building? But rehab, refurbishing, and then unfurbishing, taking it down at the end, absolutely allowable.
Should the $1 million out of $10 million be split in the 5-year periodically, or will the allowed the lump sum spending?
Okay, so when you say 1 million, are we talking? I'm not sure if we're talking about cost share or the change in budget. So
I think it's the change in budget.
Okay. No, you're allowed to, without prior approval, you're allowed to move 10% of the total program budget between any direct cost line. There's a couple caveats there, but just assume most expenses go between salaries and program or something else. Okay, so it's a 10-year project. Sorry, a 5-year project for $10 million. So 10% of 10 million is 1 million. In theory, you can move $1 million in and out of salaries without prior approval. But that would be a massive shift. And I would say sort of why you're doing that, but that is effectively the rule.
You could overspend. Maybe for that year, salaries was only going to be $1 million. And you're effectively doubling salaries. That is, in theory, allowable. But then people are going to start asking why. Why were we so off on our budget? Okay? But from a strictly legal point of view or rules point of view, it is allowable. And every time, one more thing, every time you get a budget realignment, that resets that 10%. Okay, so if you're going to realign your budget, go to your AO saying, here, we're realigning because you changed the scope or objective or all that kind of stuff. Get a reset button, and then the 10% starts again.
Okay, we are at time. It is now 10 o'clock. Like I said, if we didn't get to your question, they're going to be producing a fact sheet that answers some of these questions that have been asked that we did not get to. And also, they did say that they will share the overall presentation with the participants, as well as a video of this webinar. Catherine, they are asking for a link to the CFR 200 as well. There were several comments about that.
Yes, so we will send out all the questions with answers. We will send out the link to CFR 200 and the slide deck. And we are really appreciative of all the questions that came in. This was a very interesting and rich conversation. Doug, thank you so much for your quick presentation. I think this is a great start for our first webinar. We have the poll that is up, and 29 people have answered the poll. If you could take the time to go through 3 evaluation questions, we'd really appreciate it. So in closing, I would like to thank USAID for having this opportunity for local partners to discuss cost principles with ASAP. I'd like to thank Doug for his great presentation, and for Jeff Brown for navigating us through all the IT challenges at the beginning and asking all the questions. Thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to future webinars. There'll be one on January 9th. That will be on PEPFAR reporting. And then in January, we'll send out a calendar for the whole year. Again, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Now, Catherine, if people want to stay on, I'm happy to stay till midnight. People have questions.